A person stares at their bank account on a phone, watching the number increase but looking confused and worried. The same person receives a notification about a 5% raise at work and smiles briefly. 2 days later, the person stands in a grocery store aisle, frowning at higher prices on food. The person scrolls through Zillow listings on their laptop, shocked at rising home prices. They attempt to book a flight online, their face falling at the expensive ticket costs. The person sits at their kitchen table looking exhausted and defeated, surrounded by bills and receipts. They cross items off a budget list, including avocado toast, with a skeptical look. The finish line of financial stability appears to move farther away as the person chases it. A visual metaphor. The person runs on a treadmill labeled saving and budgeting, but the finish line keeps moving. Text appears. It's not in your head. It's not because you're bad with money. A billionaire on TV tells people to stop buying lattes while the person rolls their eyes. A dollar bill morphs into sand and slips through the person's fingers. A shadowy engine labeled hidden inflation mechanism churns in the background, siphoning money from workers to printers. A split screen shows workers losing coins while bankers and government officials collect stacks of cash. Graphic appears. Most people call it inflation. A classroom scene. A teacher points to a chalkboard. But the terrifying math is hidden behind a curtain. The person sits at a desk, determined, ready to learn how to escape the system. Intro sequence. Animated, upbeat lo-fi beat plays, with quick flashes of money, charts, and worried faces. Nick appears in a studio, greeting the audience with a friendly smile. Nick gestures to the camera, inviting viewers to subscribe and like the video. Nick leans in, elbows on the desk, ready to reveal the truth. A thought bubble shows the word inflation and a thermometer, then morphs into a basket of goods. A government official announces, inflation is only 3%. The person looks at their rent bill, which has increased by 15%, and shakes their head in disbelief. Nick explains the CPI, showing a basket of goods that changes over time. A timeline flashes by, showing the CPI methodology changing repeatedly over 40 years. A steak in the basket is replaced by hamburger meat, then by processed soy paste. A family sits at a dinner table, their food quality visibly declining each time the basket changes. A chart illustrates official CPI numbers versus shadow stats, with the shadow stats line rising sharply. Nick points to the chart, highlighting the difference between official and real inflation rates. A calculator shows the compounding effect of 10% inflation, with money losing half its value in 7 years. A calendar flips through 7 years rapidly, as the person's savings shrink. Nick says, "That's just the surface level," as images of milk and gas prices flash by. Nick stands up and moves to a whiteboard, ready to explain the deeper mechanism. Nick writes Cantillon Effect on the whiteboard, a historical flashback. Richard Cantillon writes in a book, pondering who gets new money first. Cartoon helicopter drops money, but only bankers and government officials catch it. Nick draws a pyramid on the whiteboard. Banks gov at the top, you at the bottom. Banks, hedge funds, and government contractors receive piles of cash, smiling. These groups buy assets, stocks, real estate, entire neighborhoods. A city skyline changes as more homes become owned by large institutions. Asset prices rise rapidly as new money floods in. The person receives their paycheck, but prices everywhere have already increased. The person tries to buy a house, but the price is now out of reach. The person looks at their savings account, realizing the value has diminished. A visual metaphor. Money trickles down a pyramid, losing color and value before reaching the bottom. Nick stands beside the whiteboard, summarizing how the system is designed to benefit those closest to the money printer. A final split screen. The wealthy celebrate with assets, while workers struggle to afford basic needs. Text on screen. Hidden inflation mechanism. The trap that steals your future. Nick promises to reveal how to escape being a victim of the system in the next segment. The person looks up, hopeful, as Nick prepares to share solutions. Nick sits back down, looking serious, ready to address the audience. Nick begins to explain the paradox of rising stock markets versus Americans struggling with emergencies. Visual representation of asset inflation for the rich. Graphs showing net worth increasing. Visual representation of price inflation for the poor and middle class. Rising prices for groceries, gas, rent. Nick states that this is a wealth transfer mechanism. Nick introduces housing as a concrete example. Flashback to the 1950s-60s. A family buying a median house for 2 to 3x the median annual salary. A man receives a paycheck of $5,000 and looks at a house priced at $12,000. Family saves for a down payment through strict budgeting. Contrast with today, a family looks at a median home price over $400,000. In some cities, a couple looks at $1 million home, shocked. A chart shows the ratio of home price to income rising from 2x to 10x. Nick asks rhetorically if houses got 10 times better. Visual of an old leaky house to show that quality hasn't improved. Nick emphasizes that the house hasn't changed, but the money has. Nick explains the psychological shift. Stop blaming house prices. Start blaming currency collapse. A dollar bill shrinks in value next to a constant house. Visual metaphor. The dollar melting away. B-roll of a printing press running at hyperspeed. Overlay of a chart showing M2 money supply skyrocketing. Nick explains that 40% of all US dollars were printed since 2020. Audience is prompted to process this fact. Monopoly game. Banker dumps extra money onto the board. Price of boardwalk in Monopoly skyrockets. Nick explains why saving is a losing game. Nick recalls traditional advice. Be responsible. Put money in the bank. Nick runs the math on a high-yield savings account. Visual bank offers 5% interest, but real inflation is 8 to 10%. Visual metaphor. Pouring water into a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Water pours in quickly, but the bucket empties due to the hole. Nick holds up a dollar bill and stares at it. Nick explains that money is stored time, a certificate of performance. Visual. Printing more money dilutes the value of everyone's time. A worker saves $50,000 over 10 years, but inflation halves its value. Visual. Half of the worker's savings disappear, representing lost years of work. Nick explains the mechanism keeps people broke and on the hamster wheel. Visual. Person running on a hamster wheel, never getting ahead. Nick says savings are constantly rotting, forcing people to keep running. Nick leans back, takes a sip of coffee. Tone shifts to conspiratorial. Nick asks if the system is a conspiracy, referencing smoke-filled rooms. Nick explains the incentives are aligned against regular people. Visual. U.S. national debt ticker rolling past $34 trillion. Nick explains two options for government to pay off debt: tax or inflate. Politicians dislike taxes because of voter backlash. Inflation makes debt easier to pay by devaluing dollars. Visual. Bondholders receive devalued dollars. Nick explains inflation is a hidden tax paid by everyone. Visual. Grocery bill rising due to government debt. Text on screen. So what do? Nick shifts tone to offer solutions, encouraging viewers to wake up. Nick says you can position yourself on the same side as banks. Nick introduces the hidden inflation mechanism as an advantage. Nick advises to stop being a saver and become an asset owner. Text overlay 1. Reject the cash is king mindset. Nick explains the need for an emergency fund. But beyond that, cash is trash. Visual. Dollars as hot potatoes, quickly passed along. Nick lists assets that can't be printed. Stocks, real estate, commodities, Bitcoin. Visual. Federal Reserve printing money, but unable to print Microsoft, land, or Bitcoin. Flood of money flows into scarce assets. Boats rise with the tide. Text overlay 2. Good debt versus bad debt. Nick explains the power of good debt, warns against bad debt like credit cards. Visual. Government benefits from inflation wiping away debt. Nick describes locking in a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. Visual. $2,000 mortgage payment stays constant as inflation rises. In 20 years, $2,000 is the price of a fancy dinner, but mortgage remains unchanged. Value of the house rises with inflation, loan value decreases. Rich borrow money to buy assets. Inflation destroys loan value. Assets appreciate. Text overlay 3. Invest in skills, the ultimate hedge. Nick explains that earning power is the ultimate inflation hedge. Visual. Worker learning new skills, increasing income. Specialized workers demand higher wages, general labor stagnates. Nick encourages aggressive income strategies, job hopping, side hustles, learning skills. Nick looks intently at the camera, softer lighting, empathetic tone. Nick acknowledges the unfairness of the system. Nick says the game is rigged to strip wealth from workers. Nick explains you can't change the global monetary system. Nick urges viewers to control where they stand. Visual, person standing on train tracks versus climbing aboard the inflation train. Nick warns against letting hard work evaporate in low-yield accounts. Nick encourages education and asset buying to opt out of the broken system. Nick points to the side of the screen, referencing a deep dive on fractional reserve banking. Visual, teaser for the next video on banking system magic tricks. Nick thanks viewers and reminds them to care about their own money. Nick signs off, promising to see viewers in the next video.